The Wyoming dust hadn't settled from the stagecoach wheels when Josephine Clarke stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of the Triple R Ranch and immediately broke every rule its owner had ever made. She arrived on a blistering afternoon in July of 1878, her traveling dress already ruined from 3 days of rattling across the frontier from Cheyenne. The ranch sprawled before her like something out of a dream, or perhaps a warning, with its low-slung buildings and corrals stretching toward the distant Medicine Bow Mountains. The air smelled of sage and livestock, and something indefinable that spoke of freedom and danger in equal measure. Josephine was 23 years old and running from a life she hadn't chosen. Her father's debts had mounted until the only solution his creditors would accept was her marriage to a banker twice her age with hands like raw sausages and breath that reeked of cigars. She'd taken what little money she could gather, bought a ticket west, and answered an advertisement for a housekeeper position on a cattle ranch. The advertisement had been sparse on details but generous on wages, and desperation had made her bold. The ranch owner, one Garrett Randall Reed, had written back a single letter. It contained train and stage schedules, a bank draft for travel expenses, and 3 rules printed in strong, angular handwriting. Rule 1, stay out of the east pasture. Rule 2, never touch my horse. Rule 3, be inside before dark. No explanation accompanied these edicts. Josephine had found them odd but not alarming. She'd dealt with particular employers before during her brief stint as a governess in Boston. Men of property often had their peculiarities. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Butch who'd grown chattier as they'd traveled west, deposited her trunk on the ground with a grunt. "You sure about this, miss? Reed's a hard man, keeps to himself mostly. Lost his wife some years back, and he's been meaner than a rattlesnake with a toothache ever since." "I'm quite sure," Josephine said, though her stomach twisted. She'd burned her bridges. There was nowhere to go but forward. Butch shook his head, climbed back onto his perch, and drove off, leaving her alone in the yard. The main house sat ahead, a sturdy structure of weathered wood with a wide porch. To her left, a massive barn dominated the landscape. To her right, corrals held dozens of horses. And beyond that, pastures rolled away toward the mountains. No one came to greet her. Josephine stood for a full minute waiting. The sun beat down mercilessly. Her throat was parched from the journey and her legs ached from sitting cramped in the coach. Finally, practicality overcame propriety. She left her trunk where it sat and walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped into blessed shade. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with heavy wooden pieces that looked handmade. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Doorways led off to what she presumed were bedrooms and a kitchen. "Hello," she called. Her voice echoed back at her, "Nothing." She found the kitchen and, more importantly, the pump. The water ran cold and sweet, and she drank deeply, not bothering with a cup, just letting it splash over her face and hands. It felt like resurrection. A sound from outside caught her attention. Voices, men's voices, rough and jovial. She dried her face on her sleeve and went to investigate. Through the kitchen window, she could see several cowboys gathered near the barn. They were dirty and tired-looking, clearly just in from some range work. One man stood apart from the others, taller than the rest, with broad shoulders and a hat pulled low over his face. Even from this distance, something about his bearing suggested authority. That would be Raid, she thought. She should wait inside. She should let him come to the house and introduce himself properly. But Josephine had never been particularly good at waiting, and besides, she wanted to get the measure of her new employer on her own terms, not his. She walked out of the house and across the yard toward the group of men. As she approached, their conversation died. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her with varying degrees of surprise. "Mr. Reed," she said, addressing the tall man. He turned fully toward her, and she got her first real look at Garrett Randall Reed. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a face that might have been handsome if it weren't set in such harsh lines. Dark hair showed beneath his hat, and his eyes were in startling shade of green like creek water over stones. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked tired and irritated and entirely too intimidating. "Miss Clarke." His voice was deep, with a rasp to it like he didn't use it often. "You weren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow." "The stage ran ahead of schedule," she said, lifting her chin. She'd learned early that showing fear to men like this only made things worse. "I hope that's not a problem. It's inconvenient." He glanced toward the house. "You left your trunk in the yard. I was thirsty. I helped myself to water from the kitchen pump. I hope that's acceptable." Something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or perhaps surprise that she'd been so bold. "The kitchen is your domain. You don't need permission to use it." "Good." She looked at the other men who were watching this exchange like it was dinner theater. "Should I prepare supper for everyone?" "No, the hands eat at the bunkhouse. You'll cook for me." Reed pulled off his gloves and shoved them in his belt. "Come on, I'll show you around before I clean up." He started walking, not waiting to see if she followed. Josephine had to hurry to keep pace with his long strides. The other men dispersed, but she caught a few grins and elbow nudges between them. Apparently her arrival was entertainment. Reed showed her the springhouse, the smokehouse, the root cellar. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, pointing out supplies and explaining basics. His manner was brusque but not unkind. He simply seemed like a man who'd forgotten how to make small talk. "You'll have Sundays off," he said as they walked back toward the house. "There's a town 5 miles south, Clearwater. Someone can drive you if you want to attend services or shop." "Thank you." He stopped walking and looked at her directly for the first time. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw that suggested a man who carried weight he'd rather not bear. "Did you read my rules, Miss Clarke?" "I did. Do you understand them?" "I understand the words," she said carefully. "Though I confess the reasoning escapes me." His expression hardened. "The reasoning is none of your concern. Follow the rules, do your job, and we'll have no problems. Break them and you'll be on the next stage back east. Are we clear?" Pride made her want to argue. Common sense kept her mouth shut. She needed this job. She needed the distance from Boston and Banker Morrison and the life that had been closing around her like a trap. "We're clear," she said. He nodded once, sharp, and continued toward the house. He brought her trunk inside, carrying it as if it weighed nothing, and deposited it in a small bedroom off the kitchen. The room was simple but adequate, with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "Settle in," he said from the doorway. "Supper at 7. Nothing fancy." Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he headed to what she assumed was his own room. Josephine sat on the bed and let out a long breath. She'd survived the journey. She'd survived the first meeting. Now she just had to survive everything else. She unpacked her few belongings, changed into a simpler dress, and tied her dark hair back with a ribbon. Then she went to explore the kitchen properly. It was well stocked, she'd give Reed that. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods. A herb garden outside the back door provided fresh sage, thyme, and rosemary. The root cellar held potatoes, onions, and carrots. She could work with this. Josephine had learned to cook from her mother, before the woman had died of fever when Josephine was 15. Her father had remarried quickly, and his new wife had wanted nothing to do with raising another woman's daughter. Josephine had spent her late teenage years shuttling between relatives, always an inconvenience, always in the way. She'd learned to make herself useful. Cooking, cleaning, mending, all the invisible work that kept households running. She started with something simple. Biscuits, beans, and salt pork fried with onions. Coffee, strong and black. As she worked, her tension eased. Kitchens made sense. Recipes had rules that, unlike men's rules, came with logical explanations. The sun was lowering toward the mountains when she heard Reed's door open. He emerged cleaned up, his hair damp and face shaved. He'd changed into fresh clothes, and the transformation was remarkable. Without the trail, dust, and stubble, he was actually striking in a rough-hewn way. He paused when he saw the table set, food already waiting. "It's not 7 yet," he said, "I know. But it's ready and I thought you might be hungry." She pulled out a chair. "Please." He hesitated, then sat. She served him and took her own seat across the table. For a moment, neither of them moved. She realized he was waiting for something. "Would you like to say grace?" she asked. "No." He picked up his fork. "I gave that up." It was a stark statement, bitter around the edges. She wanted to ask why, but didn't. Instead, she started eating. The meal passed in near silence. Reed ate methodically, efficiently, like a man refueling rather than enjoying. But he finished everything on his plate and accepted a second biscuit when she offered. "You're a good cook," he said finally. "Thank you. Better than I expected." "Did you expect me to be terrible?" The ghost of something that might have been humor crossed his face. "I didn't know what to expect. You're the 4th housekeeper I've hired in 2 years. What happened to the other 3? They quit." He pushed back from the table. "The work was too hard, the isolation too much, or they found my company unpleasant. Take your pick." "And which do you think it will be with me?" He studied her for a long moment. "I suppose we'll find out." He started to rise, then paused. "The rules, Miss Clarke, I meant what I said about them." "I understand." "Do you?" He leaned forward slightly. "The east pasture is dangerous. There's a ravine out there that's taken more than 1 cow. Stay clear of it. My horse is a temperamental animal that barely tolerates me. He'll hurt you if you go near him. And after dark, things happen on the range. Predators. Drifters. Men who wouldn't think twice about taking advantage of a woman alone. Keep inside after sunset. Keep the doors locked and you'll be safe. Those rules exist for your protection, not my amusement." The explanation caught her off guard. It was more words than he'd strung together since she'd arrived, and they were motivated by what seemed like genuine concern. "Thank you for clarifying," she said quietly. "I'll be careful." He nodded and stood. "I'll be in the study. I have accounts to manage. Don't wait up." He disappeared through one of the doorways, and Josephine was left alone with the dishes. She cleaned up methodically, washing and drying everything, putting it all away in its proper place. Through the window, she watched the sun sink lower, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold. The landscape was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. So much space. So much sky. In Boston, she'd felt like she was suffocating. Here she could breathe. But breathing, she was learning, came with its own dangers. She was nearly finished with the dishes when she heard it. A sound from outside, low and distressed. An animal in pain. Josephine froze, listening. There it was again. A whimpering, almost crying sound. She dried her hands and went to the back door. The sun had set, leaving the world in that peculiar twilight that wasn't quite dark but no longer light. She peered out into the yard. The sound came again, clearer now. Something was hurt. She glanced toward the study. She could see lamplight under the door. Reed was occupied with his accounts. She could go ask him about the sound, but he'd already warned her about bothering him. And besides, it was probably nothing. A coyote in the distance. A barn cat with a mouse, but what if it wasn't? What if it was something that needed help? The sound came again, more insistent. Josephine made a decision. She grabbed a lantern, lit it, and stepped out into the gathering darkness. The yard was quiet except for that sound. She followed it, moving carefully, her skirts swishing against her legs. The noise led her past the barn, past the corrals, toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near what looked like a creek. "Hello," she called softly. "Is someone there?" A flash of movement caught her eye. Something pale in the shadows. She raised the lantern higher and gasped. A dog. A large, shaggy dog was lying on its side near the creek bank, its leg bent at an unnatural angle. Blood matted its fur. When it saw her, it tried to stand and yelped in pain. "Oh, you poor thing," Josephine breathed. She set down the lantern and approached slowly, hands out, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you. Let me see." The dog watched her with wary eyes but didn't snap when she knelt beside it. Up close, she could see it was a female, probably a ranch dog that had been injured somehow. The leg was definitely broken, and there were scratches along her side like she'd tangled with something wild. "We need to get you help," Josephine murmured. "Can you let me carry you?" The dog whined but didn't protest when Josephine carefully gathered her up. She was heavy, at least 50 pounds, and the walk back to the house was arduous. By the time Josephine staggered onto the back porch, her arms were shaking and her dress was covered in blood and mud. She kicked at the door. "Mr. Reed, I need help." No response. She kicked harder. "Mr. Reed." The door flew open. Reed stood there, his expression thunderous. What in God's name? He stopped short when he saw the dog in her arms. "She's hurt," Josephine said. Her voice was shaking now, adrenaline catching up with her. "Her leg is broken, I think, and she's bleeding. I found her by the creek. Please, can you help her?" For a heartbeat, Reed just stared. Then his jaw tightened and he reached out to take the dog from her arms. "Get inside. Bring towels and water, and fetch the black bag from the cupboard in the washroom." She hurried to obey, grateful he wasn't arguing or wasting time asking questions. She found the towels, the bag, and pumped a basin full of water. By the time she returned, Reed had laid the dog on the kitchen table and was examining her leg with surprisingly gentle hands. "It's broken clean," he said without looking up. "Probably got kicked by a horse or tangled with a badger. She's lucky she didn't bleed out. Can you fix it?" "I can try." He opened the black bag and pulled out supplies. Bandages, a small bottle of what looked like chloroform wooden splints. "You're going to have to help. Can you handle that?" "Yes." "Even if she screams?" Josephine swallowed hard. "Yes." He glanced at her then, really looked at her, and some of the hardness in his face eased. "All right. Hold her steady." What followed was one of the longest hours of Josephine's life. Reed worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd done this before, cleaning the wounds, setting the bone, splinting the leg. The dog did scream, a sound that made Josephine's stomach turn, but she held on tight, whispering reassurances that probably did nothing but made her feel like she was helping. Reed didn't speak except to give her instructions. "Bring this. Hold that. More pressure." His hands never wavered. Finally, it was done. The dog lay still on the table, breathing but unconscious from the chloroform. Her leg was splinted and wrapped, her other wounds cleaned and bandaged. Reed stepped back and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked exhausted. "Will she be all right?" Josephine asked. "If infection doesn't set in, yes. She'll need to stay quiet for a few weeks while the bone heals." He looked at the dog, something complicated crossing his face. "She's a fighter. She's got a chance." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. Relief, maybe, or just the crash after all that fear. "Thank you. Don't thank me. You're the one who found her." He started gathering up the bloody towels. "Though you shouldn't have been outside after dark. That was rule number 3, Miss Clarke. The words were mild, but they hit like a slap. She'd broken his rule. The very first day, within hours of his warning, she'd broken one of his 3 sacred rules. "I know," she said quietly. "I heard her crying, and I thought I couldn't just leave her to suffer." "No," Reed said, and his voice was strange. "I don't suppose you could." He carried the dog to a box near the stove, settling her on a nest of blankets. Then he began cleaning up the mess on the table. Josephine moved to help, but he waved her off. "You're covered in blood. Go get cleaned up. I'll finish here." She looked down at herself. He was right. Her dress was ruined, her hands caked with dried blood. She looked like she'd been in a battle. "Mr. Reed," she said as she turned to go. "Am I fired?" He paused in his cleaning and looked at her. Really looked at her with those green eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to show. "No, Miss Clarke, you're not fired. But I broke your rule. You did." He went back to scrubbing the table. "And if you do it again, we're going to have a serious conversation. But tonight, you saved a life. I'm not going to punish you for that." Something warm bloomed in Josephine's chest. Relief, yes, but also something more. Something like respect, mutual and unexpected. "Good night, Mr. Reed." "Garrett," he said without looking up. "If we're going to be living under the same roof, you might as well call me Garrett. Then you should call me Josephine." Now he did look up, and the faintest suggestion of a smile touched his mouth. "Good night, Josephine." She went to her room feeling lighter than she had in months. Yes, she'd broken a rule. Yes, this job was going to be harder than she'd anticipated. Yes, her employer was a complicated, difficult man with walls around his heart tall enough to rival the mountains outside. But he'd helped a wounded dog without hesitation. He'd trusted her to assist. He'd smiled, even if only barely. It was more than she'd had in Boston. It was enough to build on. She cleaned herself up as best she could, changed into her nightgown and braided her hair. The little room felt cozy now, safe, with the sound of Reed moving around in the kitchen beyond her door. She was almost asleep when she remembered. The dog had been by the creek, near the cottonwoods. And according to Reed's directions earlier, the east pasture was. Her eyes flew open. The creek with the cottonwoods was the border of the east pasture. She'd gone exactly where he'd told her never to go. 2 rules broken in one night. She pressed her face into the pillow and groaned. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. But when tomorrow came, Reed said nothing about the east pasture. He was already up when she emerged from her room at dawn, coffee made and the dog resting comfortably in her box. He glanced up when Josephine entered the kitchen. "She's doing well," he said, gesturing to the dog. "Ate some broth I gave her earlier, that's a good sign." Josephine went to check on her patient. The dog's eyes were clearer and her tail thumped weakly when Josephine stroked her head. "What's her name?" Josephine asked. "Doesn't have one." "She's a working dog, not a pet. Every creature deserves a name." Reed made a non-committal sound. "Call her what you like. Just don't get too attached. Ranch dogs don't usually live long." It was a harsh thing to say, but Josephine was beginning to understand it was just Reed's way. He'd built his walls for a reason. She made breakfast while he read through some papers. Eggs, bacon, more biscuits with butter and jam she'd found in the spring house. They ate together in companionable silence, and then Reed stood, gathering his hat and gloves. "I'll be out on the North Range today, checking fences. Won't be back until supper." He paused. "Will you be all right here alone?" "I'll be fine. I have plenty to keep me busy." He nodded but didn't move toward the door. Instead, he seemed to be wrestling with something. "Josephine," he said finally. "About last night, the east pasture." Her stomach dropped. "I know, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how far I'd walked until it was too late. The ravine I mentioned, it's about 50 yards past those cottonwoods." In the dark, it's nearly impossible to see until you're on top of it if you'd kept walking." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, I understand. Do you? He moved closer, and his face was serious. "I'm not trying to control you, Josephine. I'm trying to keep you alive. This land is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and it'll kill you without a second thought. The rules exist because I can't—" He stopped himself, jaw working. "Just follow them, please." There was something raw in his voice, something that spoke of loss and fear and grief carefully buried. "I will," she promised. "I'm sorry I worried you. You didn't worry me." But the words were too quick, too sharp. He grabbed his hat and jammed it on his head. "I'll see you at supper." He was gone before she could respond, striding out into the morning with that long, ground-eating stride of his. Josephine spent the day cleaning the house from top to bottom, learning where everything lived, establishing her domain. The dog, whom she decided to call Sadie despite Reed's lack of interest in naming her, slept most of the time but ate again at midday. In the afternoon, Josephine made bread, the familiar rhythm of needing soothing her thoughts. She kept thinking about Reed's face when he'd talked about the ravine, the fear beneath the gruffness. He'd lost his wife, the stage driver had said. How had she died? And how long had he been alone out here, building walls and making rules to keep anyone else from getting close enough to hurt him again? She was rolling out pie dough when she heard horses in the yard. Multiple horses and voices. Male voices, unfamiliar. Josephine wiped her hands and went to the window. 3 men were dismounting near the corral, and they had a distinctly unsavory look about them. Rough clothes, unshaven faces, guns worn low on their hips. One of them said something, and the others laughed in a way that made her skin crawl. She backed away from the window, heart pounding. Reed had said drifters sometimes came through, but these men looked like more than drifters. A knock sounded at the door. Heavy, demanding. Josephine looked at the shotgun hanging over the fireplace. Reed had shown it to her during his tour, told her it was loaded, told her to use it if she needed to. But she'd never fired a gun in her life. The knock came again, harder. "Hello? Anybody home?" Sadie, bless her, started barking from her box by the stove. It wasn't much, but it was something. Josephine made a decision. She went to the door but didn't open it. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Well now, that's a sweet voice," one of the men said. "We're looking for water for our horses, miss. Been riding hard all morning." Water was a reasonable request. Refusing it would be suspicious, and besides, there was a pump in the yard. They could get water whether she helped them or not. "There's a pump by the barn," she called through the door. "Help yourselves." "Mighty kind." A pause. "You here alone, miss?" Every instinct in her body screamed danger. "No," she lied. "My husband is in the barn. He'll be back any moment." "That's so." The man's voice was full of doubt. "Funny, we didn't see anyone in the barn." "He's there," Josephine insisted. Her hand went to the door bolt, making sure it was secure. "Now please take your water and go." "What's your hurry? We're just being neighborly." The door handle rattled. Someone was testing it. Josephine's breath caught. She looked toward the shotgun again. Could she reach it before they broke through? Would she be fast enough? Sadie's barking intensified, and bless the dog, she sounded vicious despite her injuries. "Sounds like you got a mean dog in there," another man said. "Maybe we should come back another time." Or maybe we should. The sentence was cut off by a new sound. Hoofbeats, approaching fast. Josephine ran back to the window and nearly sobbed with relief. Reed was riding hard across the pasture, and he wasn't alone. 2 of his ranch hands rode with him, all 3 men urging their horses into a gallop. The men at the door heard it too. There was a scramble of movement, low cursing, and by the time Reed and his men reached the yard, the strangers were mounting their horses. "You're on private land. Reed's voice rang out, cold and hard as iron. "Get off it. Now." "We were just getting water," one of the men protested, but there was fear in his voice now. Reed had a rifle in his hands and his men were armed as well. "Then get it and get out. You've got 60 seconds. The strangers made a show of using the pump, but they were quick about it. Within 2 minutes, they were riding south, pushing their horses fast. Reed watched them go, rifle still ready, until they disappeared over a rise. Then he dismounted and strode to the house. Josephine met him at the door, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "Are you all right?" he demanded. His eyes swept over her, checking for injuries. "I'm fine. They didn't get inside. I told them you were in the barn, and then Sadie started barking, and then you came." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Damn it." Reed ran a hand through his hair. "I shouldn't have left you alone. I knew there were strangers in the area. Tom spotted their tracks this morning. I should have stayed here or brought you with me, or—" "You're here now," she interrupted. "And nothing happened. I'm all right." But he was looking at her like he didn't quite believe it. Like he was seeing something other than her standing whole and unharmed in front of him. "Garrett," she said softly. It was the first time she'd used his given name. "I'm all right." He blinked and the moment passed. Yeah, you are." He stepped back, putting distance between them. "Those men were trouble, probably wanted to rob the house or worse. If they come back, you use that shotgun. Don't hesitate, don't warn them, just shoot. Understand?" "I understand." "Good." He looked toward his hands, who were still mounted, watching this exchange with interest. "Charlie, Ben, ride a perimeter. Make sure those bastards are really gone. I'll stay here tonight." "Sure thing, boss," Charlie said with a grin that suggested he was reading more into this situation than existed. Reed ignored him and turned back to Josephine. "I'll sleep in the study. Just for tonight, until we're sure they're gone." "You don't have to, I do." His voice was firm. "I'm not taking chances with your safety, Josephine, not again." Again. The word hung between them, loaded with meaning she didn't fully understand, but she nodded. "Thank you." The rest of the day passed quietly. Reed stayed close to the house, ostensibly fixing a loose board on the porch but really keeping watch. His men returned at dusk, reporting no sign of the strangers. They'd likely moved on, looking for easier pickings elsewhere. Supper was beef stew with fresh bread, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Josephine saw Reed relax slightly. He ate slowly, actually seeming to taste the food, and when she refilled his coffee cup, he gave her a look of such gratitude that her chest tightened. "This is good," he said. "Really good. Best meal I've had in years. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Martha used to make stew like this." The words were out before he seemed to realize what he was saying. His face shuddered immediately. "My wife. The stage driver mentioned you'd been married." Stage driver talks too much. But there was no heat in it. Reed stared into his coffee cup like he was seeing the past in its depths. "She died 3 years ago. Fever took her in a week. Nothing I could do, nothing anyone could do. I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." He pushed back from the table. "I'll get my bedroll set up in the study. You should rest. It's been a long day." He was retreating again, back behind his walls, but Josephine had seen the cracks and something in her ached to reach through them. "Garrett," she said, "thank you for coming back when you did, for protecting me." He paused in the doorway, his back to her. "You don't have to thank me for that. You're under my roof. That makes you my responsibility." "Is that all I am? A responsibility?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He turned slowly, his green eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "What else would you be?" he asked quietly. A friend, she thought. Maybe someday something more, but she couldn't say that. It was too soon, too presumptuous. She barely knew this man, except she felt like she'd known him forever. "Good night, Garrett," she said instead. "Good night, Josephine." He left her alone with the dishes and her thoughts and Sadie sleeping peacefully by the stove. The days began to establish a rhythm after that. Josephine rose early, made breakfast, and sent Garrett off to whatever task demanded his attention that day. She cleaned, cooked, tended to Sadie, and slowly made the house feel like a home rather than just a place where a man slept and worked. She found Martha's things in a trunk in one of the spare rooms. Dresses, ribbons, a hairbrush with strands of blonde hair still caught in the bristles, a journal with entries about ranch life, about cattle and weather, and a husband she clearly loved. The last entry was dated October 1875. The fever came today. Garrett is worried, but I told him I'll be fine. I'm young and strong. This is just a small thing. It hadn't been a small thing. Josephine closed the journal carefully and put everything back in the trunk. She understood now why Garrett had built his walls so high. He'd loved deeply and he'd lost everything, but walls, she was learning, could be climbed. She started small. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains for the windows, a pie cooling on the sill. Things that made the house feel lived in, cared for. Garrett never commented on these additions, but she caught him looking at the flowers once, his expression soft and sad. Sadie healed quickly, as working dogs did. Within a week, she was hobbling around on 3 legs, keeping the splinted one off the ground. Within 2, she was following Josephine everywhere, devoted in the way only a rescued animal could be. "I told you not to get attached," Garrett said one evening, watching Sadie follow Josephine around the kitchen. "Too late," Josephine said cheerfully. "We're devoted to each other now. She's supposed to work. She will, when her leg is healed. Until then, she's keeping me company." Garrett shook his head, but there was amusement in his eyes. "You're a troublesome woman, Josephine Clarke. I've been told that before. I believe it." It was almost flirtatious, almost friendly, almost like they were 2 people who enjoyed each other's company rather than employer and employee. But then Garrett would remember himself, and the walls would go back up. The 3rd rule, the one about his horse, Josephine kept without trouble. The animal in question was a massive black stallion named Demon, and he lived up to his name. He was kept in a separate corral from the other horses, and even the ranch hands gave him a wide berth. "He killed a man once," Charlie told her one afternoon when she'd brought water out to the workers. "Kicked him in the head, dropped him dead on the spot." "Then why does Garrett keep him?" "Because he's the fastest horse in Wyoming, and mean as he is, he's loyal to the boss. Won't let anyone else ride him. Barely lets anyone else near him." Josephine watched Garrett work with Demon later that day. The horse was fractious, tossing his head and rolling his eyes, but Garrett's hands were patient, his voice low and soothing. Eventually, Demon settled, and Garrett mounted him in one smooth motion. They moved together like water, horse and rider in perfect sync. It was beautiful to watch, almost intimate in a way that made Josephine feel like she was intruding on something private. That night, Garrett came in late, his face drawn with exhaustion. He'd been in the saddle since dawn, checking herds in the far pastures. "Sit," Josephine ordered when he started to protest that he needed to clean up first. "You look ready to fall over. Eat, then you can wash." He sat, too tired to argue. She served him pot roast with vegetables, thick slices of bread, apple cake for dessert. He ate like a starving man, and she found herself watching him, this complicated man who was simultaneously so hard and so gentle. "Why did you come west, Josephine?" he asked suddenly. "Your letter said you were looking for a new start, but you never said why you needed one." She'd known this question would come eventually. She'd prepared an answer that was true without being entirely honest. "My father passed away last year," she said. "He left debts. His creditors wanted them paid one way or another. I disagreed with their suggested method of payment, so I left. Garrett's eyes sharpened. What was their suggested method? Marriage to one of them. Against your will. Let's just say my consent was considered optional. His jaw tightened. You ran. I ran, she confirmed. I took what little money I had and bought a train ticket. Your advertisement seemed like providence. And if I'd been like those creditors, if I'd expected more than housekeeping, the question hung heavy in the air between them. I have a pistol in my trunk, Josephine said quietly. If you tried anything, I would have shot you. Garrett stared at her for a long moment, then did something she'd never heard him do. He laughed. It was rusty, like he'd forgotten how, but it was genuine. God, Josephine. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Can't I be both, apparently? He shook his head, still smiling slightly. For what it's worth, you're safe here. I'm not that kind of man. I know. And she did. Whatever else Garrett Reed might be, he was honorable. Good. He stood, steadier now that he'd eaten. I'm going to wash up. Thank you for supper. And Josephine, I'm glad you ran. Glad you ended up here. He left before she could respond, but his words warmed her more than the kitchen fire ever could. August arrived with its relentless heat. The land turned brown and dusty, and water became precious. The ranch hands worked from before dawn until after dusk, moving cattle to better grazing, reinforcing water sources, preparing for the hard winter that would inevitably follow the hard summer. Garrett was gone more often than not, sometimes for days at a time, camping out on the range. Josephine managed the house, tended the garden, and tried not to worry about him. But she did worry. She worried when storms rolled in, vicious and sudden. She worried when he came back bruised and limping from a fall or a fight with a stubborn steer. She worried because, despite her best efforts, she was starting to care about him far more than was wise. She watched for him in the evenings, listened for the sound of Demon's hooves in the yard. She made his favorite meals and darned his clothes and told herself it was just part of her job. But it wasn't, and she knew it. The realization came one evening in mid-August. Garrett had been gone for 3 days, and she was standing on the porch watching the sunset when he finally appeared, riding in from the north pasture. Relief flooded through her so intensely it stole her breath. She loved him. Somewhere between breaking his rules and sharing his table, between tending a wounded dog and watching him work with that dangerous horse, she'd fallen completely in love with Garrett Reed. It was the worst possible thing that could have happened. He was her employer. He was still grieving his wife. He'd given no indication he saw her as anything other than a housekeeper who happened to be pleasant company. And she was a woman who'd run from one impossible situation only to land herself in another. Garrett dismounted and saw her on the porch. He raised a hand in greeting, and even from this distance, she could see he was smiling. Josephine's heart cracked and mended and broke all over again. She was in so much trouble. "You're brooding," Charlie observed a few days later. He'd come to the kitchen for some medical supplies, having cut his hand on a fence wire. "I'm not brooding. I'm thinking." Josephine wrapped his hand with practiced efficiency. Sadie, now almost fully healed, sat at her feet watching with interest, thinking about the boss, I'd wager. Her hands faltered. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't," Charlie grinned. "For what it's worth, he's brooding too. Spends half his time staring off into space and the other half working himself half to death. It's been years since I've seen him like this." "Like what?" "Like he's remembering he's alive." Josephine finished tying off the bandage and stepped back. "You're imagining things. Maybe." But Charlie's eyes were knowing. "Or maybe I've worked this ranch long enough to see when something's changing. He cares about you, Miss Josephine. More than he wants to, more than he thinks he should. He cares about everyone who works for him. Not like this." Charlie stood, testing his bandaged hand. Just don't give up on him, all right. He's a good man under all that armor, he just needs reminding. He left before she could formulate a response, and Josephine was left alone with her thoughts and a dog who looked at her with far too much sympathy. That night, Garrett came in for supper looking troubled. He ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, and when Josephine finally asked what was wrong, he sighed. There's been rustling. Someone's been taking cattle from the South Range. Not many, maybe a dozen head over the past month, but enough to notice. What are you going to do? Said a watch. Try to catch them in the act. He pushed food around his plate. It means I'll be out at night for the next few weeks. You'll be alone here. I'll be fine. I have Sadie and the shotgun, I know, but I don't like it. He looked at her and there was worry in his eyes, real, genuine worry. Those men who came by last month, they could come back, or others like them could come. Then teach me to shoot, he blinked. What? The shotgun. Teach me to use it properly, then you won't have to worry. Josephine, shooting someone is not, I know what it is, she interrupted. And I know I'll have nightmares if I ever have to do it, but I'd rather have nightmares than be dead, or worse. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, tomorrow before I ride out, I'll teach you. The next afternoon, they took the shotgun out behind the barn. Garrett set up targets, old bottles and cans on fence posts, and showed her how to hold the weapon, how to brace herself, how to aim. It's going to kick, he warned. First shot always surprises people. I'm ready, she wasn't. The shotgun roared and slammed back into her shoulder with bruising force. She staggered, and only Garrett's quick reflexes kept her from falling. Easy, he said, his hand steadying her. You've got to plant your feet better, here like this. He stood behind her, his body warm against her back, his hands guiding hers into the correct position. Josephine could barely breathe. She was aware of every point where they touched, every place his breath stirred her hair. Try again, he said, his voice low near her ear. She did. This time she was braced and the shot went wild, but she stayed upright. Better, Garrett said, but he didn't move away. Again. They practiced until she could hit the targets more often than not, until her shoulder ached and her ears rang from the noise. But she could shoot. If someone threatened her, she could defend herself. Good, Garrett said finally. You're a natural. I had a good teacher. He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his face. Come on, let's go inside. You need ice for that shoulder. He tended to her as gently as he'd tended to Sadie that first night, pressing cold compresses against the bruising, his touch careful and clinical. Except it didn't feel clinical. It felt intimate. Garrett, she said softly. Josephine. He didn't look at her, still focused on the compress. Why are you so worried about me? Charlie says you've had housekeepers before, but you never, because you're different. The words came out harsh, almost angry. Because you make me feel things I thought I'd buried with Martha. Because every time I ride out, I spend half my time wondering if you're safe, if you're happy, if you're going to still be here when I get back, or if you're going to realize this life is too hard and leave like all the others. He finally looked up, and the intensity in his eyes made her dizzy. Because I'm falling in love with you, he said, and I don't know what to do about it. The world stopped. Josephine's heart stopped. Everything stopped except for Garrett looking at her like she was water in the desert, necessary and terrifying all at once. You don't have to do anything about it, she whispered, because I'm falling in love with you too. The compress fell to the floor, forgotten. Garrett reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused hands. Are you sure? This life, this place, it's not easy. And I'm not easy. I'm broken in ways I don't know how to fix. I'm not looking for easy, Josephine said. I'm looking for real, and you're the most real thing I've ever found. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious. like she was a gift he'd never expected to receive. Josephine kissed him back and felt something inside her settle into place. This was what she'd been running toward, not away from. This man, this place, this life. When they finally broke apart, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush you. I don't want you to feel like you have to, Garrett." "Yes. Stop talking." He laughed, that rusty, wonderful sound, and kissed her again. The rustlers struck 3 nights later. Garrett and his men were waiting, and the ensuing confrontation was brief and violent. 2 men were captured, handed over to the sheriff in Clearwater. One escaped, riding hard into the Badlands. Garrett came home at dawn, dirty and exhausted but unharmed. Josephine met him at the door, and he pulled her into his arms without a word, just holding her like she was an anchor. "It's over," he said into her hair. "They won't be back. Good." They stood like that for a long time, neither wanting to let go. Finally, Garrett pulled back enough to look at her. "Marry me," he said. Josephine's breath caught. "What? Marry me? I know it's fast. I know we should probably do this properly. But I've already lost time with Martha, and I'm not going to waste whatever time I have left being cautious. I love you, Josephine Clarke. I want you to be my wife. I want to build a life with you. Say yes." She thought about Boston, about her father's debts and Banker Morrison and the life she'd escaped. She thought about the journey west, the fear and uncertainty and desperate hope. She thought about breaking rules and saving dogs and learning to shoot. About wildflowers in jars and stew by lamplight and a man who was learning to smile again. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Garrett kissed her again, deep and fierce and full of promise. When he finally set her back on her feet, they were both breathless. "We'll go to town tomorrow," he said. "Tell the preacher, do this right." "Tomorrow," Josephine agreed, "but first today. First, breakfast and coffee and the simple joy of being together. First, a beginning." They were married a week later in Clearwater's small church, with Charlie and the other ranch hands as witnesses. Josephine wore a dress she'd altered from Martha's trunk, pale blue with lace at the collar, and Garrett wore his best suit, his hair combed back and his face shaved clean. The preacher, a kind older man named Reverend Thomas, performed the ceremony with simple dignity. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Josephine like they were the only 2 people in the world. The ranch hands cheered. They had a small celebration back at the ranch, nothing fancy, just food and music and dancing in the yard as the sun set over the mountains. Charlie played fiddle and Garrett spun Josephine around until she was dizzy and laughing. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close, deliriously. "Good." He kissed her temple. "Because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." That night, Garrett carried her over the threshold of what was now their home, and Josephine finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere. Not because of duty or necessity, but because of choice and love. They made love slowly, learning each other's bodies, discovering what made the other gasp and sigh. Garrett was tender and careful, always watching her face, making sure she was with him every step of the way. Afterward, they lay tangled together, skin to skin, hearts beating in sync. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Garrett said quietly. "After Martha died, I thought I was done. That love was something I'd had once and lost and would never get back. And now I know that love isn't something you only get once. It's something that finds you when you're ready for it, when you've done enough healing to accept it." He turned to look at her, his green eyes serious. "You healed me, Josephine. You and your rule-breaking, dog-saving, stubborn refusal to let me hide behind my walls. You saved me too," she said. "You gave me a place to belong, a reason to stop running. Then I guess we saved each other. I guess we did." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, And when morning came, they woke to find Sadie had climbed onto the bed at some point and was sleeping between them. "Our first morning as a married couple and the dog's already stolen the bed," Garrett said, but there was laughter in his voice. Josephine just smiled and scratched Sadie's ears. "She's family. Family doesn't steal, they share." "Is that so?" "Absolutely." Garrett shook his head but didn't argue. Instead, he got up and started getting dressed. "Come on. Cattle don't care that I got married. Work still needs doing. And meals still need cooking." They fell into married life as easily as if they'd been doing it for years. Garrett worked the ranch and Josephine managed the house, but the lines blurred in comfortable ways. She'd ride out with him sometimes, helping move cattle or check fences. He'd help her in the garden in the evenings, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the plants. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about her childhood, about her mother who died too young and her father who'd been kind but weak. About the relatives who'd seen her as a burden and the creditors who'd seen her as property. He told her about Martha, about their brief happy years together, about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save her, about the loneliness that had eaten at him until he'd convinced himself he was better off alone. "I'm glad you were wrong," Josephine said one night as they sat on the porch watching the stars. "About what?" "About being better off alone." He pulled her closer and she rested her head on his shoulder. "Me too." The seasons turned. Summer faded into autumn, and the ranch work intensified as they prepared for winter. Garrett and his men drove cattle down from the high pastures, stocked the barns with hay, reinforced buildings against the coming cold. Josephine canned and preserved everything she could from the garden. She sewed warmer clothes, quilts, curtains. She turned the house into a home that could withstand months of snow and ice. In October, she realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been certain until the morning sickness started. She stood in the kitchen, hand on her still flat stomach, and felt a mix of joy and terror. A baby. She was going to have a baby. She told Garrett that evening over supper. Just said it straight out because she didn't know how else to say it. "I'm pregnant." He dropped his fork. "What?" "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." For a long moment he just stared at her. Then his face transformed, joy and fear and wonder all warring for dominance. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor." He stood so fast his chair tipped over. Then he was around the table, pulling her up into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said into her hair. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" He pulled back to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. "Happy? Josephine, I'm terrified. I'm going to be a father. What if I'm terrible at it? What if something goes wrong? What if I lose you the way I lost?" She put her hand over his mouth, stopping the spiral. "You're not going to lose me. I'm healthy and strong, and when the time comes, we'll get the doctor from town. Everything is going to be fine." "You can't promise that." "No," she admitted. "But I can promise I'll fight like hell to stay with you, that I'll do everything right, everything careful, that I love you and our baby more than anything, and that's got to count for something." He kissed her then, desperate and clinging. "I love you. God, Josephine, I love you so much." "I know, I love you too." Winter came hard that year, burying the ranch in snow by December. The work was brutal, breaking ice on water troughs, making sure the cattle had food and shelter, digging paths between buildings. But inside the house, Josephine was warm and safe and growing rounder by the week. Garrett was insufferably protective. He barely let her lift anything heavier than a spoon. He insisted she rest constantly, eat more, stay warm. It was sweet and annoying in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him when he tried to stop her from sweeping the porch. "I know, but humor me. You're going to drive me insane before this baby is born." Probably. But he took the broom from her anyway. Charlie and the other hands were equally protective. They checked on her constantly, bringing her small gifts, hand-carved toys for the baby, a rocking chair Ben made in the bunkhouse, a tiny quilt from Tom's wife in town. Josephine had never felt so loved, so surrounded by family in her entire life. The baby came in May, a month before their first anniversary. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Garrett's fear seemed justified. But Dr. Harrison from Clearwater was competent, and Josephine was stubborn, and when dawn broke over the mountains, a baby's cry filled the house. "It's a boy," Dr. Harrison announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Josephine's arms. "Small but healthy. Congratulations." Garrett stood frozen beside the bed, staring at his son like he couldn't quite believe he was real. "Come here," Josephine said softly. "Come meet your son." He moved like a man in a dream, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. When she placed the baby in his arms, something in his face broke open. "He's perfect," Garrett whispered. "He's perfect and he's ours. What should we name him?" They'd discussed names for months but never settled on anything. Now, looking at the baby with his dark hair and his father's determined chin, Josephine knew. "Thomas," she said. "For your father and William for mine. Thomas William Reed." Garrett looked at her, eyes shining. "It's perfect. He's perfect. You're perfect. How did I get this lucky?" "You put an advertisement in a newspaper and I was desperate enough to answer it." He laughed, careful not to jostle the baby. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Josephine corrected. "The best was when you taught me to shoot." "No, the best was when you broke all my rules before supper on your first day." Josephine smiled, remembering. It felt like a lifetime ago. That frightened woman stepping off the stage, determined to make a new start. She'd broken his rules and saved a dog and fallen in love, and somehow, miraculously, he'd loved her back. "I never did get around to touching Demon," she said. "That was the only rule I kept, just as well. He's still mean as ever. Maybe our son will be able to ride him someday." Garrett looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms. "Maybe, but that's a long time from now. For now, let's just enjoy this, our family, our life. Our happily ever after." "Yeah," Garrett said softly. They lived on the Triple R Ranch for the rest of their lives. Thomas grew strong and wild, learning to ride before he could properly walk, trailing after his father like a devoted shadow. When he was 3, a daughter came, Sarah, with her mother's dark hair and her father's green eyes. Then another son, James. 2 years later, the house was never quiet again. It rang with laughter and arguments and the chaos of children growing up on a working ranch. Josephine expanded the garden, added chickens and a milk cow. Garrett built onto the house, adding rooms for the children, a proper study, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Sadie lived to be 15 years old, watching over the children with the same devotion she'd shown Josephine. When she finally passed, they buried her under the cottonwoods by the creek, and all 3 children cried. The ranch prospered. Garrett proved himself a shrewd businessman, expanding the herd, buying adjacent land, building a reputation for quality cattle. Charlie became foreman, then a partner, eventually marrying a widow from town and building his own house on the property. Josephine wrote letters to distant relatives, tentative at first, then more confident as the years passed. She learned that banker Morrison had been arrested for embezzlement and had died in prison. Her father's debts had been forgiven after it came out that Morrison had inflated them to force the marriage. She could have gone back to Boston, reclaimed her father's small estate. She chose to stay in Wyoming. This was home now. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Garrett took her riding up into the mountains, just the 2 of them. They left the ranch at dawn, following old trails to a meadow carpeted with wildflowers. "I used to come up here after Martha died," Garrett said as they dismounted. "It was the only place I could think, the only place the grief didn't feel like it was drowning me. You never told me that. I know. I haven't been back since the day I married you, didn't feel the need." He took her hand. "But I wanted to bring you here now. Wanted you to see this place that used to mean sadness, so you could help me turn it into something else." "What do you want it to mean now?" "Joy," he said simply. "Gratitude. Love. All the things I have because you answered an advertisement and came west and broke all my rules." Josephine laughed, the sound echoing across the meadow. "I only broke 3 rules. On the first day, no less. You broke more than that. You broke down every wall I'd built. You broke through my grief and my fear and my certainty that I was meant to be alone. You broke my heart wide open, Josephine, and then you put it back together better than it was before." Garrett. She was crying now, happy tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. "You did the same for me. You gave me a home when I was homeless, a family when I thought I'd never have one, a love I didn't even know existed." They sat in the meadow for hours, talking and laughing and remembering. They talked about their children, about Thomas who wanted to expand the ranch into Montana, about Sarah who wanted to go east for schooling, about James who just wanted to work with horses like his father. They talked about growing old together, about grandchildren and the future, about everything they'd built and everything still to come. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Garrett pulled Josephine close. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not a single one. Only that I didn't put that advertisement in the paper sooner." He kissed her, soft and sweet and full of the love that had sustained them through 25 years. "Though I suppose we found each other exactly when we were supposed to. I suppose we did." They rode back to the ranch as the stars came out, and their children met them in the yard, all grown now but still eager to celebrate their parents' anniversary. There was food and music and dancing, just like on their wedding day, and as Josephine watched her family laughing together, she felt a peace so profound it brought fresh tears to her eyes. This was what she'd been running toward all those years ago. This love, this life, this beautiful, chaotic, perfect family. She'd broken 3 rules before supper on her first day. She'd found a wounded dog and carried her to safety. She'd ventured into forbidden pastures and refused to be caged by fear. And in doing so, she'd found everything she never knew she needed. Years later, when Josephine was old and gray and surrounded by grandchildren, she would tell them the story of how she came west, how she'd arrived at the R Ranch with nothing but a trunk and desperation, how she'd broken all of their grandfather's rules before supper on the first day. What were the rules? The children would ask, bright-eyed and eager, and she would tell them. About the east pasture and the ravine, about Demon, the dangerous horse, about staying inside after dark. "Did you break them on purpose, Grandma?" "No," she'd say, smiling at the memory. "I broke them trying to do what was right, trying to help, and sometimes doing what's right means breaking the rules. What did Grandpa do when he found out? He forgave me, and then, eventually, he loved me. And that," she'd say, reaching out to tousle a child's hair, "made all the difference." Garrett died peacefully in his sleep at 73 with Josephine holding his hand. His last words were her name, spoken with love and gratitude and the bone-deep contentment of a man who'd lived well. Josephine grieved him fiercely, but not hopelessly. She'd had 47 years with him, 47 years of love and partnership and joy. It wasn't enough, a lifetime wouldn't have been enough, but it was more than many people ever got. She lived 5 more years, watching her grandchildren grow, teaching them everything she knew about cooking and gardening and stubborn determination. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy with 3 rules who'd learned to love again. When she died, it was in the house Garrett had built for her, in the bed they'd shared, with her children and grandchildren surrounding her with love. They buried her next to Garrett, under the cottonwoods by the creek where she'd once found a wounded dog and changed the course of her entire life. The headstone was simple. Josephine Clarke, read 1855–1931. She broke all the rules and found home, and below that, added by her children who knew the story by heart. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she taught us that love is worth the risk. The Triple R Ranch continued for generations, passed down through Thomas's line, then Sarah's, then James's. The house was expanded and modernized, but they kept the original structure at its core, kept the fireplace and the kitchen and the small bedroom where Josephine had first slept. They kept Garrett's study with his desk and his account books. They kept the barn where he'd worked with Demon. They kept the cottonwoods by the creek, now old and gnarled but still standing. And every year, on the anniversary of the day Josephine arrived at the ranch, the family would gather. They'd cook her recipes and tell her stories, and remember the woman who'd traveled west with nothing but courage and found everything that mattered. They'd remember that she'd broken 3 rules before supper on her first day, that she'd saved a wounded dog and taught a grieving man to smile and built a legacy of love that outlasted everything. They'd remember, and in remembering, they'd keep her alive, because some love stories don't end when the lovers die. Some love stories echo through generations, shaping families and futures and the very land itself. The story of Garrett and Josephine was one of those. And it all started with a woman brave enough to break the rules, a man willing to love again, and a ranch in Wyoming where 2 broken people found each other and built something whole. It started with 3 rules and 1 desperate woman and a single day that changed everything. It started, as all the best love stories do, with someone willing to take a chance, and it never truly ended at all.